Welcome, folks. Hello to all of you. Welcome to Cafe Iktisad, a new live stream. And this one is rather different. Instead of talking about Pakistani economy and instead of conversing with you in Urdu, the tradition which I traditionally do in my vlogs. This one would be in English because it is aimed more at international audience. And the topic that I am going to speak on today is a pretty interesting one. It's kind of a eulogy, a kind of eulogy to the former Prime Minister, Indian Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh. Now, India, like China, is an economic giant and right in our neighbor. Unfortunately, despite all that animosity between India and Pakistan, it is a fact. And if nobody else wants to accept it, it's their choice. But the fact of the matter is that India is a global power. It's an economic power. It's an economic powerhouse, and well on its way to becoming the third largest economy in the world. So, as I said, it's an economic giant, and but it wasn't always like that. So, there was this process. It wasn't always like that. In fact, in 1991, and this story is well known. I don't need to repeat the story. The story was that it came things came to a pass. The fiscal condition and the economic condition was so bad that they had to take out gold from the gold seven of Reserve Bank of India and flow it to London just to get the required debt to avoid a fiscal balance of payment crisis. And that was the turning point in Indian history. That is what a lot of most of the people agree on, almost all agree on. And it was in 1991 when the late Manmohan Singh was the finance minister, and Montek Singh Ahluwalia, his close associate, and at that time I think he was the secretary to uh, Prime Minister of India, and a renowned economist too, qualified economist. They brought out a program. It was based on the what we know as now know as the M document, prepared by Montek Singh, and that led to a change in Indian economic management that started something which resulted in India now standing as one of the largest economy in the world, and not just as an economy. It's not just their economic might, more than a billion people, a huge market. It's also their economic of or foreign standing, the overall standing as a nation that has improved tremendously. And as we know, there's a very, very a very strong correlation between the economic might and the overall standing of a nation in the Committee of Nations, overall globally. So it goes hand in hand. So after 1991, after that episode, and when things started to turn around after the introduction of that M document, and as Manmohan Singh, as Finance Minister of India, later became the Prime Minister. Uh, this started something very different, kind of a lot of people call it kind of a revolution that led to India being what it is today. So yes, that moment we know, and it has been talked about a lot. And even in this program, I'm going to talk about that M document. But more than that, uh, it is important to know, and as a person who is interested in economic history, so it's important to know that those what's the background of all this. How did India, it was always a huge market since independence in 1947. Why did it come to pass that it couldn't perform? Why did it come to pass to the moment which happened in 1991, the kind of crisis that was engulfed in 1991? Not the only one, it happened before. Crisis did happen before in Indian economy. But how did it turn around suddenly in 1991? What was the realization and what was the background? Why did Indian economy didn't perform up to its standards? What was going on? So kind of these things that I want to discuss in this vlog. So I hope people start turning up, I'll just wait a few minutes before starting this vlog. But just as I mentioned, and I've got some notes with me. These are not copy pasted notes. These are just my notes on what I prepared in terms of the background of the economy, Indian economy, and what had been happening, and then how things turned around in 1991, and a few notes on the M document. Of course, I'm not going to go through all of it, but only a few bits of it, just to understand that what was happening. So I'm going to wait. Maybe a few people would turn up. Even if they don't turn up, I will do this vlog anyway and share it on my channel. So, so as I said in the start of the program, it's kind of my eulogy or recognition. There is a tradition in the field of economics that once an highly rated or an economist of a claim, when they die, people hold a kind of a vigil, kind of a remembrance webinars. There are remembrance webinars. There are talks about their contribution. So Manmohan Saab had a great standing, and he is known as the architect of Indian economic reform. So it's kind of my contribution towards remembering him and his contribution in making India the kind of super economic superpower that it is. And it's a story which is as amazing as the Chinese story is. Just like the Chinese story, that just like the amazing things that have happened in China over the last 3 or 4 decades, it's now the second largest economy in the world, set to take over the US economy in the coming years. The Indian economy is also a story, it's also a remarkable story for the simple reason that in China you had one party system which kind of pushed things. It's not exactly communist. People make the mistake of equating that with the Soviet system. It's not like that. In fact, China, there is much more allowance for decentralized system and for private sector to participate with the party at the top and their economic priorities, which they spell out in their 5 year or 10 year plans. But in India, it's nothing like that. It's politics all the way. It's a democracy. It's the world's largest democracy. It's quite messy. There are so many parties. They have to talk to each other. There are elections. So in all this, amidst all this, this happened, which is it in itself is a remarkable story. So it's worth going through that. So maybe I'll just wait a minute before starting this wonderful story, and sharing a bit of a background and with people of how all this came to pass, and why till 1991 did the Indian economy did not perform as what people would have expected from such a huge market. So it's a good story. It's something, and there is another background to it, that in case of Pakistan, what was stated in the M document actually is pretty much relevant to our case too. Of course, and unfortunately, there is a lot of animosity between the two countries. They have been at daggers drawn to each other, which is quite unfortunate. But without going into the people know the details, I'm not going to go through it. But there is no harm in acknowledging that India has done remarkably well at the economic front, and it has left Pakistan behind. Till 1990s, we were almost on the even keel. In fact, Pakistan, one of the Indian economists that I met about a few months ago, he was in Pakistan working for World Bank, and he told me that in the 1980s, when they were studying in the university, we used to look up, think about Pakistan, that what they are doing, that they are ahead of us in many of the economic criterion, and they must be doing something right. But then came the moment in 1991, and India started leapfrogging. India started gradually running away from Pakistan in terms of economic performance and economic indicators, performance on economic indicators. And now it's not just cricket where there's a huge gap between the two sides, the skills of the two sides. In fact, Indian economy, Pakistan's economy is nowhere near the Indian economy. It's not even close. It's not even a match. So a lot of lessons here for Pakistan to learn too, because the conditions are almost similar, the story is almost similar. So let's just wait maybe a minute to see if somebody turns up. If not, I'm going to go ahead anyway to tell this remarkable story with a bit of background. All right, folks. So I'll go ahead anyway, just like I record my vlogs, and whoever turns up or whoever has any questions, I'm going to answer them later. But hopefully, people do turn up. So anyway, uh, so there is a background of all this. It's not that India, since independence, Pakistan and India gained independence in 1947 together. It's not that Indian economy started performing very well since that time, and it was always a global level player. It had global might, just like it has now. In fact, it was an economy mired in what analysts call the Hindu growth rate, or the slow growth rates, with a lot of stagnation in terms of economic performance and economic indicators uh, for many decades, for over 5 decades, for over 5 6 decades, until things started to change after Manmohan Singh became the finance minister of India under Narasimha Rao's government. So what was it? It is important to understand why it was so. I mean, why was it that India till 1991 couldn't get its economic act together and achieve what it has achieved after that? Was it the it wasn't a, sorry, I wouldn't say it's a fact, but was it the case that there were no good economists at that time? No, in fact, India had a lot of good economists even at the very start of independence. One name I'll mention it here in my it's in the notes too, is B.R. Shenoy, one of the leading economists, and he remained an advisor to the Nehru government in the 1950s. Then her daughter Sudha Shenoy, she was also a leading name in India's economy. So India always had good economists. It's not that they didn't have good economists, but unfortunately, Indian economy couldn't perform well. And what hampered it? So let's briefly go through that. As again I said at the very start, I'm not going to go through the details of it because it's going to be very long. It could get very long, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details of it. I'll just briefly discuss it. So, I don't know if you have ever heard of an economic historian, Indian economic historian. I think he's at Oxford or Cambridge, Tirthankar Roy. He's one of my favorites when it comes to Indian economic history. What we have today as Pakistan was once a part of combined India. So India under the colonial times and in Mughal times. So he's a very good. He has got some very good record. Written a lot about Indian economic history, the present day India, and he has some answers, or he has come kind of a thought uh, about why. is it that the Indian economy couldn't perform according to its potential? So he brings up the case of decommercialization of India. That is what he calls decommercialization of India in the early phases since its independence. Uh, and he says that it's very lesser discussed aspect of Indian economy that India started to decommercialize after independence. In 1930s, it was a commercial economy. The ports of Calcutta and Bombay, they were the biggest ports in Asia, and it was a commercial enterprise. India was, and he brings up some statistics to say to tell us how this decommercialization took place. So he says that in 1960 the ratio of India's foreign trade to Asia's foreign trade was 1:11. In 1980 it was 1:36. By then Singapore or Hong Kong was many times larger than Bombay or Calcutta. It's now Mumbai, and Calcutta is now Kolkata. In India's economic managers 1950 to 1980 are answerable for decommercialization on a staggering scale. The West had little to do with India's decommercialization. The immediate source was loss of Asian market and a slowdown in trade overall. As major exportable goods, tea, textile, jute, food suffered from trade ban and lack of access to technology and overvalued exchange rate. But how did this happen, right? So this is his conjecture. But how did it came to pass? Why was this decommercialization taking place in India? What is behind this? What he calls this anti-capitalist thinking, and who was responsible for it? And there is an answer to that, and a lot of people in India agree to that, and a lot of that has got to do with Nehru's philosophy, Jawaharlal Nehru's. Some people call it purely socialism, the Soviet style socialism. He was very impressed with that. In 1927, at the 10th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, when he went to Moscow, and he was pretty darn impressed with that. And this is what he said, which kind of tells you his thinking, that I had no doubt that the Soviet Revolution had advanced human society by a great leap and had lit a bright flame that could not be smothered. That was Nehru. That was in 1927. So he was kind of a Fabian socialist, or a socialist, communist socialist. A Fabian is a group in economists which was pretty close to socialism, not exactly communism, but that was his philosophy, and most people in India agree that Nehru was like that. So he, from the very start, Nehru had socialist ideas. He didn't like those capitalist idea of laissez-faire economy, or economy molded on the style of Western countries or Western industrialized nations like the United States, or those in Europe like Britain. He was very impressed with USSR, and we know that India and USSR had very close relationship, just like India and Pakistan and America had, because India was assuming. P- uh, I mean, people assumed that it was in solely in that block, which India wasn't. India, since very start, has maintained a policy of being neutral. So, anyway, ji, that was Nehru, and we get an idea of that strain, where and it again, it's Tirthankar Roy. He mentioned something very interesting. He said that at the very start, and it was even before the independence in 1944, there were two leading industrialists, leading capitalists, or leading businessmen of India. One was JRD Tata, and the other was JD Birla, and there was an economist with them by the name of John Mathai. They came up with a plan, a 5-year plan, advocated that India should go ahead when it gains its independence. It should go ahead with the Soviet style planning. And in fact, it was called the Bombay Plan. It was in 1994, where they advocated that there should be a central directing authority that should be running the economic management of India. This was 1994, before independence. And the same people, JRD Tata and GD Birla, actually were pretty close to Jawaharlal Nehru. So they had an impression, an imprint on the say of how it is going to be. So that strain, Nehru was in that socialist strain was there in Nehru, and that socialist strain was all there in businessmen too. But this is surprising because you would expect businessmen and industrialists not to conform to that, and central planning and bureaucratic controls, because central planning comes with Soviet style central planning comes with bureaucratic controls, a lot of bureaucratic controls. So why would they agree to that? Why would they advocate that? And there is no specific answer. As per Roy, Tirthankar Roy, what he assumes, and he had an answer to this, and probably seems right. He thought that this is what he said, that they were quietly siding with the protectionist xenophobic lobby in politics. These people did not represent Indian capitalism. India was still mainly a trading economy. They represented a section that diversified into industry. Their interests were aligned with the protectionists. The industrialization to come did not serve India as well as it served the interests of some of the signatories. So what he's suggesting is that they knew that after independence, they would industries would come under strain due to competition from other nations. They were probably expecting that. So, in order to avoid that competition, they came up with this central plan and to buy themselves protection against competition. That is what Tirthankar Roy's thought is, and it sounds very logical because otherwise, capitalists and industrialists they wouldn't argue for this kind of plan, which was pretty socialist or pretty communist in nature. So then I told you about Nehru and his strain, that socialist strain of his, and it is reflected in many of his actions. And I'll just go through few of it. I'm not going to go through every bit. Of course, in Indian economic history is a vast one, just like Pakistan since 1947. So in 1955, when he was the Prime Minister of India, and the ruling Congress Party, they declared under Nehru declared the intent for a socialist pattern of a society. So in India, and over the first 3 decades, when even Nehru wasn't there, and his daughter Indira Gandhi ruled India, there was a continuous strain of nationalization of industries. And then first national in 1953 they nationalized aviation, life insurance in 1956, banks in 1969, and coal mines in 1973. So this is a continuous thing. First it was Nehru, then it was his daughter Indira Gandhi that continued on with it. So it kind of brings to fore Pakistan's experiment with nationalization, which was another disaster as it was in India, when in 1973 the then Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto came up with his nationalization, wholesale nationalization of industries. And till this day, majority of economists, there are some who side with him, but majority of economists lament that moment in Pakistan's history, Pakistan's economic history, as a disastrous one with far-reaching consequences. So this was happening across the border too. And mind you, just as an injunction, Pakistan took the a very different path to India. While India was under a socialist thinking or a centralized planning thinking, Pakistan, in fact, in the 1950s and early 60s, you would see it as a very different sort of an economy, as more of a laissez-faire type economy, and in its industrial growth was remarkable. So was its business, so was its per capita income. It's only in 1970s when it started to turn turtle, and in 1990s when Indian reforms under Manmohan Singh came by, Pakistan started to lose the plot, and India started to run away from Pakistan. And the difference now is huge, as everybody would with economics would understand. But anyway, so then there is that very important aspect, and I'm not going to go through details of it. I'm in fact going to post my notes on this thing for anyone who would want to read this. There was this very important case of private property. Now, private property, as everyone with background in economics or even in law, finance, or related disciplines would know, that private property is very important, or protection of private property is very important for functioning of a capitalist system. Uh, but in India, we see something different happening. In 1950, it's when its constitution was passed. There were two articles that guaranteed private property. One was Article 19, in fact 19(1)(f), and then the other one was Article 31. These guaranteed private property. But Nehru, when he came up with his first amendment, I think it was in 1950 or 1951, when he came up with his first constitutional amendment, he kind of tried to sideline these when he introduced the ninth schedule, which limited the power of the courts to interpret these articles and implement these articles. Why was he doing that? Because of his wholesale program for redistribution of wealth, which kind of is a big thing in socialist and communist economic management. He wanted to redistribute large parcels of land. And in presence of these articles, and if the courts wanted to implement it, it would have been very different. So he introduced the First Amendment to the Constitution with a schedule which made it very difficult. One of the things that happened due to that article was that court cases regarding private property started piling up. Then in 1977, something important, something very interesting happened. There was a judge. I think his name. Let me just see. His name was V.R. Krishna Iyer. In a case in 1977 related to this enforcement of private property, he interpreted Article 39 Part B, 39B. And as I said, I'm not going through the details of all this thing. I'm just just kind of scratching the surface. Other people have spoken about it, written about it in India, and I don't need to go through it. So I'm just going barely scratching the surface. So what he said was that ownership and control of material resources of the community are to be distributed at best to subserve the common good. So Justice Ayer, in a dissenting note, judgment that even private property is part of a community resources. That is what he said. This was 1977. In 1978, the Janata Party, which was in government then, came up with Article 300A, and this was probably the 44th constitutional amendment, which made right to property just a human right. So it kind of did away with private property rights. It said it's just a human right. But and then following that, there was this very important or very famous case of 1983, probably 1983 or 82. It's called the Sanjeev Coke case. So it was basically a coal mine, a coal industry, or an industry running on coal or dealing with coal, uh, and sen- it was nationalized. They went to the court, and the court kind of decided against them, given under the interpretation of what Justice Krishna Iyer took of the Article 39B and community resources. So a lot of people thought that this is a kind of a death knell to private property. Only last year, in November 2024, Justice D.Y. Chandrachud and eight other judges. Justice Chandrachud was the in fact, he has now, I think he has now retired. He was Indian Supreme Court's Chief Justice. He and eight other judges uh, removed this interpretation, or outlawed this interpretation, 1977 interpretation, kind of bringing back private property and its enforcement and its sanctity back to the fore. And in their remarks, they said that it was inspired by a certain ideology. They didn't name it, but obviously it was. They were talking about socialism, or Fabian socialism of Nehru. It declared that Indian constitution cannot force an economic ideology, and declared all private resources as and declare all private resources community resources. So basically, they were saying that not all resources are community resources. Some are private resources, and they should be that way. So you see that strain of socialism, or strain of redistribution, that had a lot of impact upon not just economic management or the halls of economic management in the planning ministry in India. It also went to the courts, and and the interpretations of some of the judges, it affected that. This was just one case, but saying that, it doesn't mean that there was no opposition to what was happening in India. So for example, as I said before, and at the very start of this vlog, that India was blessed with good economists since the very start, and there were many who opposed it. And the pivotal moment did come in 1991, definitely. But it wasn't just in 1991. Even before that, there were many who opposed what was going on. That socialist strain, or that communist strain, or that central planning, and what was happening in that. There were many economists, there were many dissenting voices who opposed that and said that this is wrong. And I'll just name a few. One is uh, Jagdish Bhagwati. He's a well known economist and Nobel Prize winner. India has produced many top of the line economists, and Jagdish is one of them. So Jagdish wrote a book with another leading voice of his time and a remarkable achiever. She was a female economist. Her name was Professor Padma Desai, and she later wrote a book about her journey, breaking out an Indian woman's American journey. Uh, she and Jagdish Bhagwati wrote a book in 1970. It came out in 1970, and its title was "Planning for Industrialization and Trade Policies since 1951." And what it talked about was, it basically brought forth the failure of central planning in India, and how they critique, and how that license raj, or that protection, had not done any favor to the Indian industry. So this was one voice amongst the many. So there was another Dr. Ishar Judge, and she also, from the 70s, 1960s and 70s, she was also, through her studies, opposed what was that socialist planning thing and controls and license raj in India, and said that it's not going to work. And it was Manmohan Singh, Dr. Manmohan Singh, who later commented that it's an unfortunate fact that their names, or the early names of those early reform proponents, especially those female ones. I just named two. Professor Padma Desai and just Dr. Ishar Judge, that they remained unadmired. That is, and unacknowledged in India. So then there was, as I mentioned at the very start of this vlog, there was a leading voice, or leading economist of the early 20th century, and he was an Indian. His name was B.R. Shenoy. B.R. Shenoy was part of Nehru's cabinet, or Nehru's advisors, who advised them on economic affairs, and he was the only one who opposed what Nehru was doing in terms of central planning, in terms of bringing all his policies of redistribution and what he thought about economic management. He was the only opposing voice, and then his fight, or his thinking, was continued by his daughter, who later got a doctorate in economics. Her name was Sudha Shenoy. And Sudha Shenoy, while she was an undergraduate at Xavier's College in Ahmedabad, she wrote an article, or an essay, in a US magazine called Freeman in 1962, as an undergraduate, which opposed what were the kind of license raj and kind of socialist experiments, or the socialist economic management that was going on in India. So the gist of all this is that it's not that there was. Then in 19, obviously, the story about Montek Singh and Manmohan Singh is well known. Even Manmohan Singh, and I think I came across a paper in 1964, in late 1960s, probably 1964 65, where I read Manmohan had written about, Dr. Manmohan Singh had written about the failure of Indian economic policy and the futility of Indian economic policies. So there was the gist of all this is, before I go to the M document and just briefly discuss it, the gist of all this is that there were dissenting voices, a lot of dissenting voices in India, in terms of how the economy was managed. And this was before 1991. So the background was there, that ground for reforms had been those voices that we need reform. They had been there. They had been there before Manmohan Singh. Then Manmohan, with the help of Montek Singh and Walia, he came up with his plan. And we know after that, that story is well known. Montek Singh used to work at, and I think it used to work at World Bank before Manmohan Singh asked him or advised him to come back to India, where he joined the Planning Commission. And in 1991, when these reforms came along, he was the secretary to Prime Minister, I think, if I'm not wrong. But anyway, this was the gist of the talk, was that the ground had been prepared before that, before 1991. The economist community in India, I wouldn't say they were in majority, but at least there were a lot of dissenting voices that was not happy with the affairs, not happy with the economic management and how it was going on in India. So over the 60s, 70s, you're going, or even in 80s, you're going to find talk of and written material about how things should be turned around and how things were not working and what needs to be done. So that pivotal moment, it came in 1991. As I said, it was kind of forced upon India. That story is well known, that things became so bad that they had no other option but to carry on the reforms. They had to take out all that gold from the vaults and fly it to Britain and take debt and keep that as security. Just this year, in fact, that gold, if I'm not wrong, that flew back to India. So what happened was that it was forced upon that. In fact, Manmohan Singh stood up in Parliament as finance minister, and he said something like that: the no, nothing can stop the idea whose time has come. So what he was talking about was his reform, and the basis of that reform is that famous M document prepared by Montek Singh, and it was in, I think, 1990. So then, so what did that M document said? And interestingly, when I was reading that document, again, it's a long document. I'm not going to go through all of it. It's available at different places. I read it from the Mercatus Center. If you go to their website, it's, I think, Project 1991 or 1991 project, where you can find the complete documents. It's more than 30 pages. I'm not going to go through all of it. Of course, I'm just going to go through some of it. The interesting thing is that when you go through that document and when you read that document, it strikes you. At least it struck me as an economist in Pakistan, that you could just kind of feel that perhaps it was written, or you can be mistaken for thinking that this is perhaps happening in Pakistan, what he has written in 1991, because things feel eerily similar. There isn't much difference between what he's talking and what we are experiencing in Pakistan, again and again, and even right now. So a lot of similarities. It struck me a lot. But anyway, I'm just briefly going to go through the document. I'm not going to go through all of it. Not everybody would be willing to listen. So document, what does it do? It starts with the urge to continue, or in fact further speed up the liberalization process. So it was being done before. It wasn't that it was not, there were no steps in deregulation or deregulating the economy, or having lesser license large for what had it had been. But Montek Singh said that what it had been carried piecemeal. It hadn't been what he expected, and it needed to be speeded up. So he gave the example of Eastern Europe and other countries, and he said that, look, they are all liberalizing for a reason after the breakup of USSR. And it was not just, he used the word demonstration effect, that it was not just for showing off. It was not just for showing off what they were doing. It was needed, and India kind of needed that kind of liberalizing strain and liberalizing economic management after the fall of USSR and what had been happening in the Indian economy. It wasn't working, so we need to change that. So he said, what he said was that So he gave the example of successful developing nations, and he said that they were integrating into the world economies, and India wasn't. India wasn't well integrated into the world economy because it had a lot of protections, that license Raj thing that we often get hear about. So he said that industry, the Indian industry, had been significantly impaired. He used the word impaired due to restrictive environment. What he meant was that Indian industry, just like it is happening in Pakistan, and it has happened in Pakistan over the last 5 or 6 decades, they were hiding behind protection. They were not for competition. They weren't competing with the world. They were afraid of it. And Montek Singh said that it has impaired their ability to compete, and these should be removed. This is although there is consensus on the need for liberalization, and as I mentioned, he said that there is consensus, but it was already it was just taken kind of in an ad hoc manner. There had been some liberalization, but it was ad hoc, and there was no specific plan to go ahead with all of it. So, and for that, Montek mainly blames the bureaucracy. Sound familiar again? Sounds very much like Pakistan, which with its compartmentalized mindset that it's my turf. Who are you to tell me what I should do? So it's those bureaucrats that come through a centralized exam, one exam, and then they start to decide that how your economic management is going to take place. So Montek pointed at that, and he said that these kind of short-term measures won't do. We needed a medium-term or long-term strategy. At the end of the document, he said that the M document is basically a medium-term strategy for coming up for turning around the fate of the Indian economy. So let's move forward, and I'll just quickly go through it. I gave you the background that there were already a lot of people who were criticizing these policies, that Nehruvian strain, the socialist Fabian strain, and then the centralized planning strain. So this is followed by, it's a very important para about the working of a deregulated model or an economy which can lead to more efficient resource mobilization. Um, so he calls for the macroeconomic equilibrium. Montek says that there should be a macroeconomic equilibrium that should go hand in hand. In fact, he says that it's more important than just liberalizing, because liberalization or the laissez-faire kind of thing won't do much without a macroeconomic equilibrium, which is more important than that. So, what was the macroeconomic equilibrium? How would you achieve that? He listed 5 steps for achieving the macroeconomic equilibrium. He said that achievement of macroeconomic, the first one, achievement of macroeconomic balance with high investment levels, reform and redefine the role of the public sector, reducing and restructuring the domestic controls over production and investment licensing, the license Raj, and reducing the degree of protection of Indian industry. Protection how? Under tariffs. And we are very familiar with that in Pakistan. This is how it used to happen in India. And it has been happening since the last 5 decades in Pakistan. Just like Montek Singh had mentioned, that Indian industry tries to hide behind protection to avoid competition, which is for anyone who knows a bit of economics and his economic lessons, he would know that hiding behind protection is basically kind of hurts. In the end, it hurts the consumer because you don't get good quality of products. And vehicles or cars is a prime example in Pakistan. It's one of my favorite example. We have like 3 or 4 producers who produce very ordinary stuff. I would sorry to say, but shitty stuff. But it's priced in gazillions because there is no competition. You can get the same stuff from India or China at less than half the price. But there are so many tariffs and protection to the local industry because they start crying, raising hue and cry that we are going to lose jobs and it is going to be destructive for the country and blah blah. That's bullshit. But anyway, and Montek Singh and others before him saw through that bullshit. So the last one was the opening the country to the foreign direct investment. So let's briefly go through these five ones. The first one, he then turns for macroeconomic balances. He turns to fiscal deficits, and he said that these need to be controlled. This is a real problem, fiscal deficit, and these need to be controlled. Um, he called it dynamic instability in the Indian economy due to this fiscal instability, and that needs to be bring down. For that, he advocates many things. He even brings in the defense budget. that it needs to be controlled, and a lot of the fat in the armed forces that needs to be non-combatant. What he says was it needs to be cut down. Then there is bureaucracy. Montek has a good grasp of the system. He said that even he doesn't advocate any shock therapy. KG was cut down everything else, cut down everything. He said that it should be gradual, but he was very confident in advocating that 10% of the workforce in the public sector could be immediately discarded or thrown away, and it won't affect the public sector at all. He had a good grasp of the system. And there is another point where we can see that his grasp of these things is Montek's grasp of this thing is good. The Indian system is good, where he advises against consultations and moving things on files. It's kind of this trick of consultation that let us consult और चले जी file जो है उस पे चीज जो है file पे चलाएं. So it's bureaucracy's way of delaying things or making a suggestion futile. So Montek was aware of that. He was part of bureaucracy. He said that don't do that. Do away with consultations. You can just go ahead and cut the 10% of the force at least, and it won't affect the workings of the public sector at all. So and here's what Montek, obviously being a qualified economist, he gave the example of fertilizer subsidy, and in terms of the fiscal deficit, that he said that these kind of things are futile. And again, this is very much general in nature. It can be applicable to any country, Pakistan or other. He mentioned that we have been giving fertilizer subsidies since long, but the subsidy since 1980, subsidies, he mentioned at 1980 level, maintaining its subsidized price of fertilizer since the 1980, since the 19 till the 1980 level. So basically, what he was saying is, okay, they were giving subsidy to the fertilizer companies so that the price of fertilizers could be maintained at the 1980 level. But then he also mentions that you see, on the other hand, that the prices of the final products have doubled. So it's kind of futile. If the prices double, then what is the subsidy for? Subsidy is there for keeping the prices constant or manageable, but yet the prices have doubled, and they keep paying subsidies. So that's Montek. That's your economist right there, with a very good grasp of basics of economics. Economics, and he said that it's a futile and it's a huge burden. These kind of subsidies are a huge burden upon the fiscal resources of India, and those need to be done away with. And then again, you see the pragmatism on his part, on part of Montek Singh and Walia, where he suggests that some subsidies may be justified. Why? Because they are political in nature. So you see a pragmatic economist there, because politics and economics cannot be separated, are difficult to separate. You have a political government who would take political decisions, and there would be some compromises. And Montek kind of accepts that fine, there would be some compromises. He like in terms of his analysis of industry and his reform proposal in the M document, he suggests certain subsidies for far-flung areas, and he said that these kind of things, because they are political in nature, they are necessary. They're not favorable, they are not favorable to the final outcome, but anyway, they are necessary because they are political in nature, and we have to, there is no option but to go ahead with them. So there is that pragmatism as an economist, not just economic theory but practical on ground things. So then we move to this right to work program. There was this suggestion of right to work program at that time, but Singh says that no, look at your fiscal resources, look at your fiscal strains. It's not going to happen. Quite interesting. If things do improve and we do have the fiscal resources, perhaps we can go ahead with the right to work program. Now, interestingly, when Manmohan Singh became the Prime Minister of India, he did implement a right to work program, the rural support or rural work program or rural work guarantee program. I don't remember the name, but it was a program that guaranteed 100 days of work. But only after Manmohan Singh became the prime minister in 2004-5, not before that, because Montek Singh was of the view, and it prevailed that we don't have the resources to carry out that kind of a program. It's kind of a subsidy too. So you see, uh, it's a very pragmatic and it's very economic in nature. So then we move to the public sector reforms, an important one. So Montek Singh, basically he says that, as I said, that he isn't in favor of shock therapy, that just cut it out everything. He isn't in favor of that. In fact, he said that he advocates a strong public sector, right? So this is important to understand. He advocates a strong public sector, but the one that is dynamic in nature, that is competitive, that kind of public sector. And if it's important, this one is important, this point is important, that if it wants to take contract, the public sector, this is a big problem in Pakistan, that the some of the public sector institutions or the public sector contractors, they lap up all those huge contracts for a very shitty quality of work. So Montek was this was happening in India too, but he said that if you want to take contracts, you'll have to bring in quality, you'll have to be competitive, you'll have to be dynamic. So he was talking about a strong public sector but dynamic, and he said that at the same time the public sector would be accountable. So these were his two suggestions. He said that this is how the public sector should be. Then we move on to the industrial. It's another important aspect of this M document. It's the industrial licensing and control and the infamous license Raj. There is acknowledgement that some big regulation has taken place again, but Montague was of the view that it was just piecemeal and ad hoc. You need to move further, you need to move fast, and you need to be continuous in your in deregulation, in affairs conducting deregulations, and remove. He said remove license Raj. Don't do partial deregulation. Go ahead with a plan that it brings down all this deregulation. It kind of deregulates everything and brings down. He mentions tariffs too. The average he this is what he said about the rates of and he brings in the MRTP Act, which is related to, which was used a lot in the guise of containing monopolies, कि जी monopoly हम नहीं बनने देंगे. He kind of criticizes that, aimed at limiting the monopolist again. Instead of licensing a public sector regulation, Montek advocates pressure from competition. उसने कहा था कि competition देंगे. He said bring in competition if you are so worried about monopolizing and monopolies, because otherwise you are giving it all this economic management or all these affairs in the hands of bureaucracies, that who they would be deciding that whether there is a monopoly or not, and whether they should be giving licenses to industries or not. He didn't see any advantage of that. Then, as I said, he advocated lowering of tariffs, and he mentions there's a table in the M document, the use of high tariffs and ad valorem taxes. He questions them. At the mean ad valorem taxes at that time were 137, uh, and compared to Pakistan's 90. And we still, even in 1990s, Pakistan had high taxes, but look at India's, it was 137. It was very high. They had high tariffs, they had high ad valorem taxes. And Montek Singh said that this is hurting India's industry. All those licenses, all those MRTP acts, they need to be done away with, and Indian industry needs to be more competitive. So does its public sector. Bring in more competition, external and internal, and that would do the trick. We don't need license Raj, we don't need MRTP, and do away with this thing. And the last portion of the document concerns foreign direct investment, where Montek mentions these are pretty interesting number for a country as huge as India. The FDI at that time was only $200 million. That's very paltry. That's nothing. That's nothing compared to 2.3 billion in China at that time, 1991, 700 million in Indonesia, and 650 million in Malaysia. So India was way behind for an economy with more than a billion people, reaching a billion people at that time, and or maybe a more than a billion. It was $200 million is nothing, and then you are comparing it with other countries, Asian countries, and their level of investment was, compared to India, it was quite high. So Monte questions the tolerating approach towards FBI, that suspicious approach. That why is FDI coming in? Is going to hurt our national security? Again, you can see that kind of repeating what you can fit that in Pakistan's perspective, we are always suspicious. Our establishment is always suspicious of these kind of things. Any foreign direct investment coming in, and I won't go into the details. I mean, there were a few attempts during last tenure of Nawaz Sharif that perhaps one or two Indian businessmen. He met Indian businessmen. He met Indian businessmen before, but whenever some businessmen from international level and especially from India comes along in Pakistan, there is always this question raised by various sources that this was going to hurt national security. So Montek, this kind of strain existed in India too, and Montek questions that tolerating attitude. That's the word he used, approach toward and list many advantages. He's This is what advocacy is about. This is what it is about, that if you take a position, then you support it. So Montek is supporting that position in favor of FDI coming in and doing away with that suspicious or tolerating approach. He said that there are many positive spillovers. um, Aside from the monetary amounts coming in, it's increased access to financial capital, linkages with global market participants, access to advanced technology and technological infusion, sources of software inputs like management style. So these are some of the things that he jots down, and he said that this is what FDI brings along, and we need to do away with the suspicious approach to FDI. He additionally cautions that FDI is not just about liberalizing import regime and forex control, but also about individual freedoms and quality of infrastructure and overall level of governance. So that's a beautiful way of advocate supporting your position. Now we move towards the conclusion. As I said, that he kind of summarizes what he said, and then he mentions very clearly that this is a medium-term document. This is not for short-term, medium-term, and long-term document. Now, folks, as I just went through this M document, I went through the background of all this. It is important to realize that it wasn't easy, but for me, as I said, that thinking that we need to do away with that socialist strain or in the Indian economy, or the centralized planning, bureaucracy-led planning, the license raj things. This was all along. This was happening all along. In the 50s, there were voices in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. In 1991, their hand was forced. But what happened was, and this is where I think what made the difference was that both Manmohan Singh and Montek Singh, they were successful in cobbling together both the opposition and the government. Now, remember, Narasimha Rao's government wasn't a very strong government. They didn't have two-third majority, so they had to cobble together a kind of a thinking, kind of an agreement, kind of thinking that look, uh, and they we had Montek Singh in one of the webinars when I was at PIDE, and this is what he said was that they met the opposition leader the late Atal Bihari Vajpayee at that time. Then, and they convinced even within their party, the Congress party at that time, there was a lot of opposition in the government circle. So they kind of convinced everyone. That is where their success lies, and that is where Pakistan fails. They convinced both the people within the government and the opposition that look, you can do whatever you want to do, you can have your politics, but India needs to move from its position because we are in dire straits, and it's what how we've been operating since 1947. It's not going to work anymore. The world has changed. We need to change. We need to get rid of what we've been doing, and this is where their success lies. This is where their maturity shows. Pakistan lacks that kind of maturity. We don't have that maturity. It's juvenile tactics. It's not that Pakistan doesn't have any good documents. Pakistan has had a lot of good documents over the years, prepared by economists of fame like Dr. Mahbubul Haq. Then a few years ago, going to give you a few examples. Just a few years ago, we prepared the PIDE Rapid Growth Strategy. If you see that document, it has input from former finance minister, leading economists. It's a wonderful document, covers everything in where that is wrong in Pakistan economy and we need to reform. Then there are reports on civil service reform. Then there are other institutes. There was one report, a good report in PTI's government, led by Dr. Zubair, who was the chief economist. Then there are other institutes in Pakistan, like the Prime Institute. They publish good reports. So it's not that there are no good reports in Pakistan, no good documents in Pakistan, but that consensus that Montek Singh and late Manmohan Singh Sahab was able to develop between those who were governing and those who were in opposition, between the political parties, that look, whatever you want to do, go ahead with your politics, but don't disturb this thing. We need to change tact. We need to change the economic management, and they all agreed with that, and it worked perfectly well. It worked wonderfully well, and that maturity, you can see that a lot of the decisions that Dr. Manmohan Singh took, they were followed by other during his tenure as prime minister. For example, Aadhar is a huge program in India. So BJP government kind of continues with that. So that kind of political maturity in Pakistan is lacking. What happens over here is that even if a good program is implemented by a government, normally there are very few, but there are some. The next government that comes by, it kind of immediately dispenses off with that government or makes it ineffective. So that kind of political maturity lacks there. So there is that for the M document and India's economic rise. I kind of gave you the background of India's economic rise and what forced the hand, what happened in 1991, Montek Singh, Manmohan Singh, and their contribution. So I hope people, whoever attended, kind of got the gist of this wonderful story. It's a wonderful story, just like the Chinese story. China and India are two remarkable examples of how economic growth lifted millions and billions of people out of poverty. And what they did, it's a wonderful thing for Pakistani policymakers to study and to think about. So hopefully, I'll see you next time around. Thank you very much. Goodbye and take care. Allah Hafiz.